Right. I think that's it. I think we're going to make a start. So good morning, everyone, on this beautiful sunny Thursday. We're really glad you've joined us. My name's Dawn. I'm going to be your host for today, and we're doing a webinar today on making an impact, top tips on how to thrive in your HR leadership role. Just to kick off, bit of housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so a copy will be emailed to you after the event, along with an accompanying ebook that we've done on your first 90 days as a HR leader. So a lot of the top tips that we'll be talking about today are brought to life within that ebook. And if you've got any questions during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature, and I'll be keeping my eyes peeled so we can answer those at the time, because this is going to be more of a conversational webinar. As I introduce our special guest as well. So your host today is me. My name's Dawn. I'm Enterprise Client Lead at WorkBuzz. There's quite a few people on the call today who may not have come across WorkBuzz before. So just a quick intro. WorkBuzz is what we like to think of as HR's secret weapon. So we enable organisations to gather real-time feedback from your people through regular employee listening. This ultimately enables you to improve the employee experience, build a more inclusive culture, and ultimately make smarter people decisions. We're really passionate about helping organisations improve their culture, but ultimately link engagement to business metrics such as retention, absenteeism, inclusion, and safety. So you can find out more about WorkBuzz by visiting our website at the bottom. And we've got some great customer stories on there. And the naughtiness in me included a superhero photo of our founder, Steve Frost, up in the top right-hand corner. Steve loves a prank, so I couldn't resist joining the dots between us being HR's secret weapon and Steve dressed up as a superhero. So bear with me on that. So that's a little bit about WorkBuzz, but more importantly, today's content is really all about you, your new role in a leadership role in HR. And a couple of months ago, we created this ebook, and we were really lucky to involve Neil, who's our guest, who I'll introduce in a minute, in curating that for us, really, and helping us shape that content. Those first 90 days are crucial. And so the ebook really kind of brings that to life with some really clear top tips. So you can download that from our website. As I said, we're going to share it afterwards. But if you're interested in finding more content linked to the employee experience, then you can join our Employee Experience Hub. And if you scan this QR code, then that will take you straight to the hub, and you can join as a member. You can take part in some of our e-learning, download ebooks. We share content all the time that's relevant to everything from ESG to retention, the big resignation, all sorts of stuff. And we'd love to see you in there for anyone who's really passionate about the employee experience. So Neil, thank you so much for joining us today. Neil is a great human being that I've got to know really well over the last 6 months. But not only that, he's so experienced, and we're so lucky to have him join us today. He's got over 25 years experience working as an exec and non-exec director and a board member with leadership roles spanning organisations from Standard Chartered Bank through to the Post Office, and most recently where our paths crossed as Chief People Officer at HS2. And this is where the partnership between WorkBuzz and HS2 really blossomed in us helping Neil kind of really link engagement and improve the employee experience to powerful business metrics like retention, as we've said before. So welcome, Neil. Thank you so much for joining us. I feel I've got to know you over the last 6 months, but do you want to tell the listeners a little bit more about you, your story, how you ended up in HR? Did it choose you? Did you choose it? Tell us more.
Thanks, Dawn, and look, thanks everyone for joining today. Yeah, you'll get the materials for this after the event if you read the first 90 days document we've co-authored. But I hope to give you a little bit more of a personal insight, and that's going to be kind of warts and all. The advantage of having had a long career is that you do make mistakes, and sometimes you learn from them, and sometimes you don't. So that's kind of my pitch for you today about my story. Actually, HR found me, but it found me in a slightly odd way. I left university in 1986, which obviously makes me impossibly old. And I wanted to work in what we then called personnel. partly because I had an interest, a genuine interest in employment law. I'd wanted to read law at university, hadn't managed to do so. So I thought, if I go into personnel, I can qualify through some legal aspects and perhaps become a lawyer later on. So I got a graduate training scheme entry into HR in 1986 when we called it personnel. And the rest is kind of history, which is odd because that was my degree. So I kind of chose to go into it, but what I chose to go into turned out to be somewhat different. And I never did major in employment law, and I never did become a lawyer, which might have been my initial inclination. I kind of found my way in personnel into human resources and stuck with it as the role and remit really grabbed my attention. So that's what's kept me interested, active and involved in this world of business and HR for the last, 35 years now, 25 years in director level jobs.
And talk to us about some of the organisations you've worked with as well.
So my career choices will look quite odd to some, but they're kind of reflective of my personality. I'm a slightly restless soul. I'm a kind of lifelong learner and striver. I like to try and do different things. So most of the organisations that I worked for are characterised by broadly these two things. They were all in need of some large-scale transformation or change, and I wanted to be in that change situation because the people issues really come to the fore when the business is going through a rapid response or a rapid acceleration of some sort. And then the sort of second thing is, and you mentioned some of the names, I worked at the Midland Bank, I worked for Booker PLC, Serco Group, Standard Chartered, Gallagher, Ministry of Justice, Post Office, HS2. I worked across all sorts of different sectors, and kind of my restlessness was, once I'd actually done a job and done it to my satisfaction and hopefully that of others well in a company, in a sector, then my next inclination was always to try and put myself to the test somewhere different, somewhere new. So whilst change was the constant thread, transformation was the constant thread, I liked putting my professional and personal knowledge to the test in different situations. So that explains a career at the end looking back, which perhaps lacks an overall narrative beyond the fact that it's eclectic and has got an enormous amount of differences in it. And I tended to be better in organizations that allowed me to shape the content of my job rather than put me in a box saying, that's the job that we want you to do. Now, that isn't everyone's inclination or cup of tea, but I kind of quite like space to work out how things could be and should be, rather than just being given a much more structured or controlled or directed environment. And that's probably a first point I'd make about, you're learning about yourself as you go from job to job. You can't fit, none of us as human beings can fit into all different cultures. So kind of knowing where you fit and what gets the best out of you is probably the start point when you're thinking about your next HR job, because you can't easily make yourself fit into environments and do things that just don't suit you. It's harder work.
No, and I guess that brings us nicely into the content for today, really, and how crucial and vital those first 90 days are in role. You've gone through that recruitment process and hopefully you've got a sense of that fit. But why is this subject so important to you personally, that first 90 days piece?
Well, I'm clearer now about what energy I get and what benefit I derive from work than I've ever been. Nowadays, I can say to myself quite safely that I work at my best where I share in the purpose of the organisation, where there's a chance to make some form of personal or professional difference, where I'm learning something and where I'm working with good people. But I wasn't always that clear or focused, and I made some bad choices, normally when I ignored one or possibly more than one of those things. And I was just quite keen to, looking back as I was on an executive career that's recently ended and I've now gone plural into a kind of non-executive, I was just keen to perhaps share some of those observations and self-learning. There's no doubt people on this call who are much younger than me, who are in big jobs now, who've worked out the things already that it took me much longer to work out. But in the event that there are still some people questioning themselves or puzzling a little bit around why one job worked out and why one didn't, I just thought I'd share my observations on what worked for me and what didn't work for me. Wishing I'd wishing I'd woken up to some of these things a bit earlier on, actually.
I think it is something that comes with age and experience, though, isn't it? I think as I get older, that connection to purpose and making a difference just feels stronger than it ever has. So I don't know if it is something that you have to go through those experiences to really find out what those things are. I don't know if any of the listeners want to share any of their reflections on that. Have you reached that ultimate point where you know what makes you tick, where you know what matters to you the most when you take on a role? But talking about,
I'll make an observation, Dawn, on that point, and this is being really quite candid. So I was I was a little bit fixated as a younger man on doing well in the eyes of others. So it mattered to me that other people thought I was being successful. Now that's rooted in a whole bunch of issues associated with my upbringing, being an identical twin. I'm not going to share that with you. It's not a therapy session, but that desire to be seen as successful through the eyes of others led me to mistakes. So for example, I probably set out in my career slightly arrogantly saying, you know what, I'd love to be a FTSE 100 group HR director when I get to my career pinnacle. I didn't quite know how I was going to do that, but I had in mind that would be the ultimate destination. And indeed, I was appointed to that job in 2007 when I joined Gallagher Group, which was a tobacco group. And I was very motivated by the fact that I could then tell people that I'd joined a FTSE 50 business as their group HR director. And therefore I've been successful. And you know what? I joined the wrong company. I got so fixated with the idea of achieving my career pinnacle that I achieved it in the wrong place. I didn't have any great affinity with the product they made, which was tobacco. They had no track record at all of hiring from outside of the company, let alone the industry tobacco, into their top ranks. So it was obviously going to be very hard yards for an outsider like me to fit in. And as a result, it wasn't a particularly enjoyable 3 years. My role and remit was arguably smaller and less, and I felt less welcomed and less embraced than I had done in almost any job up to that point. So there was the dilemma. I told the outside world I'd achieved my career pinnacle, but I was in the wrong place. It was a relief to me that at the end of 3 years, Gallagher was acquired by a competitor, and the shareholders did very well out of that deal, and I was able to take a package and go and find something that suited me more. So when you're talking about the first 90 days, perhaps look a bit upstream first of all and think about your motivations for your next role, and understanding a little bit more than I did then what you do well and what you don't do well, and try very hard to make a choice that's based on finding the right organization and the right role, rather than just some form of tick box exercise or reflected glory. Because if you've ended up in the wrong place for all sorts of reasons, it just makes settling in and making a contribution harder.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what's the role of a HR leader?
Well, I think my learnt experience is that whatever's written down in the job description you've been given through the hiring process, going into a new job, about what's actually required and what you then discover is really needed, there's quite often a bit of a gap between those two things. And I think settling into an organization is really all about working out whether there is a gap, and if so, how much. Have you been hired to do what's needed actually, or what people think might be needed, with all the constraints and limitations that brings? So here's my pitch on what I think HR is and does. I think we're overall responsible for building the capacity, capability and culture of the companies that employ us, so that those companies succeed in turn in their chosen markets. Because if capacity, capability and culture aren't right, you're very unlikely to get strategy and plans executed. And ultimately, the differentiation in strategy is the doing, not the quality of the thinking. I've very rarely seen companies magnificently execute entirely the wrong thing to do. Most fail to do the right thing because they're beaten to it by others. So that's my idea of what HR is and does. That's a very big brief, however you look at it. But often when we join companies, the extent to which things are seen by them as being fit for purpose in that capability, capacity, culture space, and what might need to change isn't really understood at all. So as an HR leader, you end up in effect sometimes having to both define the extent of the problem that really needs to be tackled and then get everyone on board with implementing the right solutions to tackle the problem. So you get a job description, but actually the role tends to be something else. And I'll make this real for you as an example. So back in 1999, I was hired to join Serco Group PLC, a FTSE 250 support services company. And I was their first ever group level HR director. And I was told in the interview process that the major challenge facing me was to fix the back office administration in the business in the UK and implement a new payroll human resources information system covering a UK workforce that then covered about 18,000 people. That's what they said they wanted. That's what the job description said. And I had the skills to do that. So on the face of it, I was a really good hire, and that was all very clear. But actually, the real issue facing this company was how to scale for growth. They were going to need to hire an enormous number of people, and they also had to ensure that the UK government, which was then a Labour government, wasn't going to be embarrassed by any race to the bottom in terms of terms and conditions of employment through any failed implementation of their new TUPE regulations. And the Labour government's paymasters were trade unions, and Serco had a terrible reputation with trade unions. So the real issues that I had to fix turned out to be repositioning the company's approach to TUPE, making sure that the trade unions signed national agreements, 12 of them, with Serco seeing us as a decent employer. And that then directly enabled us to win contracts and transfer 28,000 people more from the public sector into the private sector and deliver good contracts and good services to the public and government. And yes, of course, I implemented the human resources information system and the payroll solution. But that was a housekeeping issue. Now, so I've been hired actually, arguably, with a completely different skill set to the job that turned out that needed to be done, where I think I made a major contribution. So I'm betting there are some people on this call who've joined a company, and that company has said during the hiring process, here's the job description. We really need you to come in and do this. And then you're looking around yourself and you're thinking, well, I understand why that looks important, but what about all of these other things? And sometimes the company that's hiring you doesn't know what they are. And then it becomes quite interesting how you get them to alight upon those things and gradually influence and shape them to move to where they need to be rather than where they thought they needed to be. I would say that Serco story, which illustrates that has been a consistent pattern throughout my career. It might be that I've just chosen organizations that were going through a lot of change, as I said, because that's what I like doing. But ultimately, I don't believe you can, when you become an HR leader, take on trust that the people hiring you know what they want. I think your job is to take that as the start point and then work out whether it's really what's needed or not. And if it isn't, what is?
And I guess it goes to show how much listening needs to happen in those first 90 days, just to get to the crux of that as well. So I guess credibility plays a huge part in that and building trust, doesn't it? So once you've been appointed, how do you go about establishing that credibility quickly? And actually, we got a comment from Gemma on the chat that basically said, I think it's important to deliver on promises because that can easily gain trust and create momentum as well. But how do you build that credibility?
So I think Gemma's onto something, that this is the real dilemma, isn't it? There isn't one of us on this call, I imagine, who, when you take on a big new role, doesn't feel, at least inside, a tremor of anxiety around, I need to make sure that I need to get something done here. I need to demonstrate that I'm the right person for this job. They've placed a lot of faith and trust in me. I need to demonstrate that I'm good enough for this. And of course, that creates a sort of internal pressure around the rush to action, almost, doesn't it? And here's the slightly odd advice, because whilst I'm not denying there won't be some issues that have to be fixed from day one, and there might not be some low-hanging fruit that to ignore it would be just plain silly, the reality of your first 90 days is, if you're ever going to get a chance to understand the landscape that you've joined, a new role that you've joined, and really work out what needs to be done, this is the time when you have to do it. So for me, I think if your mindset is in your first 90 days to remember, I'm not being judged on what I do, but I am being judged on how well I'm fitting into the company, then you have a slightly different mindset, because this is all about how you conduct yourself in one-to-one meetings, how you do it in front of teams, with your senior colleagues, with your boss, the CEO. It's how aligned your personal behaviors are to the values on the wall, because people are watching you, how you behave and how consistently you behave in certain ways. They're looking to see what the authentic you, both the good and the bad, look like. And you have to fit in at least enough before you can fix things. So you don't need to get anxious about performing. And I speak as someone who's naturally predetermined to get anxious about performing. You really must try to calm yourself down and don't get anxious about performing. Relax and use this precious time to learn about what you've joined. And here's another illustration for you. So when I joined HS2 back in 2017, this was my last corporate role. I did it for 4 years. I finished at the end of last year. When I joined in November 2017, I learned that there had been 2 interim human resources directors in rapid succession before me, both of whom had only been there a few months. So they must have failed. And I was told for different reasons. One was a management consultant who'd arrived with a plan and then started trying to implement it without first working hard enough to get people on board. So they were bright enough to understand what the company needed to fix. They took on face value the company had already decided what it was they needed to fix as an interim and tried to get on with it. But actually, there was not enough buy-in or listening or getting people on the same page. So that kind of failed because it wasn't bought into. And then the second interim was a very experienced HR director who quickly won a reputation for being very abrasive and often very angry, and with a tendency to let that show in public and get a bit shouty, when the values on the wall for HS2 were all about respect, integrity, safety, and leadership. So neither of those interims were aligned to the prevailing culture. And so they failed, but for different reasons. So behaviors is why each of these ostensibly on paper, good people failed, nothing else. So to reiterate, you build your credibility in your first 90 days by listening carefully, acting in accordance with the values, and this proves you are the right person and therefore worthy of further time and investment. And you're building a foundation for them proving that you're also the right professional. So I'm kind of encouraging people to learn to slow down a bit and be a bit less anxious to make an impact, because building the relationships is what's going to make sure that when you choose to move into action, you've got more chance of being successful.
We got a really good question from one of the attendees, actually. So it says, hi, Neil, how do you try and help individuals at director level to understand culture and vision needs to be strong before taking the next steps for strategic growth?
That's a really, really great question. You know, you find out quite a lot about whether you're going to have the opportunity to have that conversation in the interview process. Let me give you a top tip. Once I realized that it really mattered to me who I worked for, in the last 3 jobs that I accepted in my full-time life, professional life, once they decided to offer me the job, I then said, before I sign on the dotted line with your contract of employment, I would like to take you, and it was the CEO in each case, I'd like to take you out to dinner so that we can have a good conversation about our lives and our backgrounds and our beliefs, and just talk about this job again. So in effect, I decided that I needed to test whether I could make a genuine personal connection with my boss before I put myself in a situation where I was working for them, where inevitably that personal connection is slightly harder to form, not least because the CEO, looking at an HR director, has a degree of even-handedness across the executive team as well. But we're trying to establish from the outset that you might be a bit of a sounding board. So I think if you've done that when you come in, it's a little bit easier to then have those honest conversations. So I'll give you an illustration of how that then worked at HS2, because after I'd done that with Mark Thurston, who was the CEO, he joined about 6 months before me. He's still there doing a great job. After I'd done that, when I joined, Mark sat me down again and he said, on the back of having learned a little bit more about me, he said, remember, Neil, you're walking into a mess, just as I did 6 months ago. I don't think this can be fixed overnight. I'm not expecting you to do that. I'd like you to tread carefully and listen carefully. I'd like you to act as a sounding board for me. If there's anything you want to share with me at any time or any point, please do so. And then when you're ready, let's you and I have a discussion about your thoughts, observations, insights, and your first thinking about a plan. And I'll help you shape that as a presentation to the rest of the executive team and then the board. Now, what a supportive boss that was.
Amazing.
That's why I was a success, if I was personally a success at HS2, because I was working with somebody who knew how to relate to me, but I put the effort in to make sure we could relate. And that same style also permeated the executive team. So, you really have to be in a situation where you've built some strong relationships, and in particular with your boss, before you can start doing what Gemma says, which is sort of influencing and shaping people to think about things that might not be on their radar. And that culture piece and the way we behave and do things around here, it's a very important thing. I always, at the end of my 90 days, had some reflections on how the organization could be improved. And I never didn't comment on the values, behaviors, and culture of the place. And if I was looking at the evidence that came from my workplace survey, engagement survey provider, so much the better, because it's objective rather than subjective. There is data. The data needs to be interpreted, but there's still data. So data is always useful.
And we've had HR directors come to us in those first 90 days as an external partner almost to get that external view from the survey results as well, just to give some insight kind of as well. So I think, my next question is really about how you get to know the business. But just one more question that we've had from Kate, which links to what we've just been talking about. So, and what does the panel think about HR moving away from transactional HR into a more agile, human-centric strategic role, which is what we've been talking about ultimately. Over the years, I've been to many conferences where sessions have been around HR getting their seat at the table. And I think that's what we're talking about here. It's that shift away from HR being seen as that transactional piece, but into that more strategic role.
Well, how they've positioned, how your potential employer has positioned HR is clear from the documentation that you'll read during the hiring process. And it's also clear from the positioning that the headhunter or recruitment consultant may give it. And my learned experience would be, if it looks like an operational role, it's an operational role, because that's the expectation. The issue for me around the Gallagher job that I mentioned was it was largely an operational role and not much opportunity for strategic input, and that's all they'd ever seen. And they wanted the back office fixed and, which was relatively easy to do, but relatively dull for me. The harder judgment is where somebody says, we want HR to have a seat at the table. We want it to be a strategic voice. We want something different, but they don't know what different is or looks like. So your interview process is a due diligence on how committed or how ready they are to do this, as is forming the relationship with the boss, the two things we've already talked about. If I give you another example, when I joined the post office in 2014, the post office had a very, very clear mission. Basically, the business hadn't made any money for about 20 years. It was losing 120 million pounds a year on a billion sales. And it had recently been separated from the Royal Mail. So it was a standalone business, but still in the public sector. And the government basically said, here's some money. We'd like you to invest in modernizing it, but there's going to be no more money after that. And we expect you to get rid of those losses in the next 3 years. So that created a very clear perspective on three things needing to change. The headcount needed to reduce. The headcount needed to be different. In other words, new skills and capabilities built in, particularly in digital. And there wouldn't be any part of the business that wouldn't be touched. And they'd come to the conclusion in framing that message that this was largely a restructuring, reorganization job. And of course it was at one level. I think I probably took out about half the directly employed workforce. The work that we actually ended up majoring on was building an entirely different culture, and in particular a different relationship with our franchise holders, because they were the core of the business and they'd been neglected. Everybody in the post office had looked at the branches they ran, whereas 9/10 of the business was run by small business people who owned a franchise operation. So the whole organization had to pivot to listening to the customers and users that were in the franchise network. And that created the need for a different culture at head office. And getting them to understand that was an iterative thing over about 12 months for me. And what really did it was working with WorkBuzz in its predecessor guys and doing a survey of the franchise holders. And there the data was as clear as day that they felt neglected and underinvested in, and that they needed that situation to change. So again, it goes back to the three things we've talked about already. Listening and learning very carefully, great relationship with the boss and senior colleagues, gradually putting forward ideas and looking for data sources to back them.
And I guess just taking on Kate's question with another perspective, what impact has the pandemic had on that as well, in terms of that shift away from HR being seen as transactional to more strategic? I guess looking at it from our perspective, or my perspective in particular, is that it's had to become more human-centric, more agile, because we've been dealing with things that we've never dealt with before, and that requirement to pivot quickly has never been more required of people. So what effect has the pandemic had on that?
Yeah, I spent my last 2 years at HS2 being both chief pandemic officer and chief people officer. I mean, I was responsible for managing the safety of all of our colleagues on sites and in offices throughout the entire pandemic, and also ensuring that we were able to work efficiently and effectively, and also, as I'm sure everyone else is, trying to work out what the future of work would then look like. And more change has happened in the last 2 years and will happen in the next 2 to 3 than arguably happened in the world of work, despite the tremendous rise of the use and investment of technology. More change in several years than probably in the preceding two decades or so. So that has undoubtedly put HR leaders' voice at the top table more often, and certainly more willing to challenge the status quo and to be heard as having a different view or perspective. By the way, this is permeating into the non-executive world and also the board advisory world, where I spend my time, not just HR leader appointments. Everyone's suddenly worked out that there's a skills shortage. We need to get more work done and more productively done from the employees that we've got. It's harder to hire people. We've got to keep people. All of a sudden, that people agenda is front and center for more or less every industry and sector and every employer, and everyone's winning or trying to win a real war for talent that's going on. Great time to be an HR professional. I'm almost sorry that at the end of 36 years, I've just moved on to the next thing now, but fantastic time to be an HR professional. And you'll see this in the number of vacancies and HR jobs in the market. It's boom time with all of the HR recruitment businesses at the moment, placing people like you on this call.
So let's bring it back to the 90 days. So we talked about the credibility. We talked about, making an impact, those different bits and pieces. How do you get to know the business really well in those 90 days?
Well, I think there's a mindset thing, first off, that the one advantage of being new is there's absolutely no embarrassment at all in asking questions in the exec meeting or a board meeting when you don't understand something. So I always had the confidence to say I didn't know. And I used to find that when I did that or asked questions, I usually wasn't the only one in the room needing to ask the same questions. So you immediately had some support and sympathy from people in the room who were unable to be as open. So don't be embarrassed about the fact you don't know. You're only expected not to know for a certain period of time. Use that as a luxury to ask questions. The second thing is your senior colleagues are expecting you to show the same interest in and passion for the business that they have. So it's a really important signal that you send to them quite early on around how much time and interest you're showing in what they care about. So when I joined HS2, for example, having being new to construction and new to rail, I recognised I had to close that gap. So I had monthly tutorials with the technical director for a year on high-speed rail, so I could learn the terminology and jargon that the sector used. And that effort was seen, and it was seen as being essential, and it was appreciated by my peers and very much appreciated by the technical director. And of course, that created another firm, fast relationship around which I could pivot and get things done. And then two other observations. You've got to do your desktop research properly. So your first 6 months is your chance to look at the wealth of data sources that exist on how the company is doing. You've got the annual report and accounts, you've got the management accounts, you've got board papers, you've got strategy documents, you've got investment appraisals, you've got reports that analysts write on your sector and company. They're all a matter of record. They all give you a really good view of what other people think are going on. And you also have your people metrics, including your engagement information. And then, you know, the most important thing, and I've come to it last, but it isn't last, it's first, is it's your frontline visits. You don't understand the company just by reading about it or talking to senior folk. You only understand the company by being with the people who service customers and meeting customers. So genuinely, almost without fail, in my first 90 days joining a company at any point in the last 20 years, I split my time 50-50 between reading myself into it and meeting senior stakeholders and visiting sites, frontline staff and customers. You have to meet customers. You don't exist without them. I'd worked to get that induction, onboarding and plan in place, by the way, before I joined any company. I would ask about it, clarify what I wanted to see and do before I signed my new contract on the dotted line, because I had the bargaining power to make things work the way I needed them to before I joined and before I signed. And once you join, the danger is you get rushed by the swamp of things to do, and you get really super busy very quickly, going back to that anxiety point I mentioned earlier on, and there's no time to plan it. You have to plan it and get it diarised and organised before you start, and then stick to it.
Yeah. And you touched on earlier how important engagement data is, and it'd be remiss of me not to mention WorkBuzz at this point in terms of the richness of the data that's available from engagement surveys, from pulse surveys, from diagnostics that have been done in the past, especially presumably some of the open commentary that comes through from that as well, because you can't speak to every frontline worker, but it actually gives you a really good insight into how people are feeling, especially if you can break that down by different areas.
It does. And here's just as an observation around how companies work with companies like WorkBuzz. I mean, there's a tendency, isn't there, to look at a company as a homogenous thing, and there's a data set covering the whole company, and then you kind of get a bit fixated on the reds, the questions that don't look like they're good answers. But any one survey is not relevant unless you can put it into the concept of trends. So what's changing? Otherwise, it's just a snapshot. It might not be relevant. You need to look at what the trend is. Yeah. So when you're looking at your engagement stuff, you need to look backwards. And then the second observation is, in all of your other engagement with people in the business, you start to form a view quite quickly around which functions are more critical and are more important to the organization. Now, obviously, you don't go around saying this. You don't say this function is important, that function is not important, but some functions are absolutely crucial to the success of a business. So you kind of want to drill into your survey data and look at what it says about those functions. An illustration for you, it became clear to me during my initial 6 months at HS2 that ahead of us was an enormous pipeline of contracts that would have to be let with suppliers to build the railway. And I started asking questions about, you know, the size and scale of our procurement and commercial teams. And then I started seeing the workforce plan data, and I could see that there were gaps and there was quite a hiring challenge ahead of us. And then I looked at the engagement survey information, and I could see really low levels of engagement and some really obvious issues around levels of line management support and capability. And then I looked at my other people metrics and could see high levels of sickness and absence and churn. And then I stepped back and said, so if HS2's major purpose in the next 12 to 24 months is define, let and manage contracts to get the railway built, this looks like a really important enabling function in the commercial and procurement space. And if we don't get that team up to scratch, we're bound to fail all these milestones. And I went to my colleagues on the executive team and the board and showed them this picture, and they'd not, of course, they kind of intuitively understood it, but they'd not seen that picture before. And actually, interestingly, and we'll talk about HR in a minute, whilst I was preparing this picture, I kind of talked to my HR function that I'd inherited at HS2 and said, so what's going on in commercial and procurement then? And I'm going to sound very harsh here, they didn't have a clue. They weren't focused on it. So they weren't treating commercial and procurement as a priority. So that's an example of how over a kind of 6-month period, both from looking at the data sources on paper, meeting the right people, getting out there to the front line and checking, you gradually start to iterate a view on what's important and what isn't, to help you make the pitch at the end of the 90 days around where you need to focus and spend your time. And if it is rooted in evidence, you can be incredibly compelling in the way you present that. It was like an oh shit moment when I talked about the commercial and procurement function and the risk to our organization.
Just being conscious of time, we've actually got a couple of minutes left on the scheduled webinar, but I'm tempted just to carry on for another 10 minutes because we're going to be sharing the recording after. So for those that need to go, feel free to drop off and you'll get the recording so you can listen to the last 10 minutes. But there's just a couple more questions I'd love to ask while we've got you, Neil. It feels as if we need to carry on. So as I said, I'm gonna keep asking questions. If you need to drop off, do, and we'll send the recording so you can catch up on the last 10 minutes. But thank you for joining if you do. How do you build a great HR team, Neil? Because to your point, you joined a HS2, you inherited a team, so you're learning their skills, what works, what doesn't. How do you make sure you've got the right people around you to deliver on that strategy that you've got in your head to implement?
There's no such thing as an HR priority, only business priorities that HR is working to solve. So every time an HR function tells me that there are some HR priorities, it's a real warning bell for me. It's like an alarm bell going off. I asked my HR team when I joined somewhere 3 questions. In one-to-one and in team conversations as I'm getting to meet them all. These 3 questions are, what are the major issues facing the company right now? What does the company need to do about those issues? And what are we working on in HR right now that's aligned to that? And believe me, at the end of about several weeks of meeting your team individually and collectively using those 3 questions as a framework, you know exactly how much and how quickly you may need to change the composition and organization of the team. And then you have to start working out your sequence and plan to do so. When you've got an HR view of the world, I always then find it interesting, by the way, to compare and contrast that view with the ones from the board and the business, probably using much the same format, because the disconnect usually signposts where you really have to focus. And how quickly do you do this? Let's just work backwards. If at the end of the 90 days, you've done your kind of settling in, you've fitted the culture, you've listened carefully, you've put together some thoughts and ideas, you're getting ready to present those to the business. If you present, this is what the company needs to do, and here's how my function's here to help you, and you haven't got a plan around how my function's going to need to change, because right now we're not fit for purpose to do that, then your credibility is shot, because you're offering a plan that everyone looking at your function and you will say, you've got no chance of getting that done yet because your team's not fit for purpose. So you do have to lay out a plan with clear milestones and outcomes to get things done, which includes what's going to have to change about the HR function. And you end your onboarding period in effect with that move into action, having got that signed off, both what you're going to focus on and what needs to change in your team in order to make sure that focus won't be wasted and it will actually get done.
And so by the end of those first 90 days then, what did you create? And did that differ from employer to employer? What did that look like?
It did differ from employer to employer. So two contrasting situations. At HS2, things were so badly broken that not to act would have been just negligent on my part. So I was very decisive in the situation. At the end of 6 months, I was signing off a new people strategy with an HR operating model and a transition plan for the function. And a year after I joined, so 6 months after that plan had been signed off, 2/3 of the team that I inherited had been replaced with people that I'd hired, that I trusted to be competent to get the job done. I had little time to delay in making an impact. So I listened carefully, made my plan, and then implemented it. So 6 months to draw up the plan, get it signed off, and 6 months to make most of the changes. And it was brutal. I mean, it was really, really hard work, but this was a failing HR function and a failing business. But a decade earlier at the Ministry of Justice, I did things differently. I sensed, not least because it was a civil service environment, that evolution, not revolution, was required. And so the HR transformation roadmap and plan that I produced at the end of 6 months painted a 3-year picture, not a 1-year picture. One that still nonetheless cut central costs by about 30% in the HR function, but on a voluntary basis. And there was more time, and the pace of the organisation required there to be more time, because this is a very consultative environment that wasn't used to hard-hitting, fast-moving pace of change. By the way, there's a story I tell against myself, but this is the judgment you make about individuals. And single points of failure are always what worry when you come into an organisation. So here's the story. I had an individual who was the only person, a learning and development professional, and I won't mention the name because that would be unprofessional, but this learning and development professional wasn't very good. They were the only person in the HS2 HR team, though, who knew how to run an offline antiquated system by which we ran the annual year-end performance review process. And in order for that process to start, the first thing I had to do was to make sure that person knew what their own performance rating was. So all of my team said, even though this person wasn't very good, you've just got to give her a kind of average performance rating, because if you don't do that, she'll just have a strop and disappear. So I said, I'm sorry, I've been here 6 months. My judgment is that this is a needs improvement performance rating. So that's what I'm going to give her. So I gave her the needs improvement performance rating. She had a strop and disappeared. I had nobody to run the year-end performance review process. And we couldn't access the system. She just disappeared. So what's the learning lesson? Well, funny enough, I went to my colleagues and said, we're going to have to delay doing this whilst we work out how to do it. This is why I've done what I've done. And they were all very supportive of the fact I'd made the right choice against the values, that you couldn't not call out performance if it was in question. But my team were pressurizing me not to do that because it was going to make life easier for us and easier for them. I was prepared for the risk and the downside. We still, when we get together now, the survivors and thrivers, we still laugh about that moment as a key learning moment. And incidentally, the individual who I let go has gone on to have a good career somewhere else, just where it was probably better for them to be. There was, it's never just the individual's fault that it doesn't work out in an organisation. But I made the right call in moving somebody on, and there you are, at some personal cost and pain at the time, I have to say.
Well, I think it's like going into every conversation. I always like to talk about going into those conversations with positive intent. It's about doing the right thing by the individual and by the organisation, and that's where culture really matters, isn't it, in terms of being values led and bringing it back to those values.
Yeah.
So the meaty stuff then, looking back, tell us about the mistakes that you would avoid if you possibly could from your own personal experience. Come on, dig the dirt. Dish the dirt.
There are four. I mean, there's more than four, but if I had to reflect just on 4 things, you do have to fit in with the culture just far enough if you're ever going to change it. Now that is really quite difficult to judge well. I can still remember in the arrogance of youth, making a bad mistake. I can remember being sat down actually at Serco Group by the chief executive about 6 months in, and he said, I like you, I like your ideas, but I need other people to like you and like your ideas. You just need to work harder building the right relationships with people. And this gentleman, Kevin Beeston, who's gone on to a very successful career, he did something quite powerful. He said to me, you can play the Beeston Joker. I will come and rescue you if it's gone really badly wrong with one of my colleagues. But I'm really judging you on whether you need to play the Beeston Joker. So just go out there, relax a bit, take a bit more time, don't rush the fences, and build those relationships. So you have to fit in with culture just far enough if you're ever going to change it. The second thing is, don't isolate yourself from everyone else. You're a people leader, and you're expected to be better than average at developing and nurturing relationships. So if, like me, you're a bit of a policy wonk or a data wonk, and you really love reading stuff, and you'd far rather do the analysis and then present people with your grand plan and ideas, just remember that's not going to work. You have to put the equal amount of time into meeting, discussing, talking, and listening to people, even though it doesn't feel like it's adding value, or it's only confirming what you already know because you've worked it out already. So that's the second. My own tendency, the learned experience, was much more time needing to be spent on building personal relationships and being a better people leader myself, in order to be able to say to others how they might do it. And that's an ongoing thing. The third thing is, poor behaviors only ever count against you, and they'll be used against you too. So at HS2, there was a reason why the previous 2 interim HR directors left, it made me more than averagely aware of the fact I needed to keep some of my own personality traits in check, and to behave properly and to behave in a way that was expected. And what I did there was really just keep asking for and seeking reassurance and feedback on how I was coming across. And that requires a level of humble that doesn't come easily to C-suite executives, and didn't come easily to me. And then the last thing is the one we were just touching upon. If your team's not fit for purpose in HR, don't wait too long before you start making the changes. They know it, they're expecting it, and if you wait too long, the better people in your team will lose patience and go. And the ones that got rid of the previous HR director and the one before that, they'll be quite happy that you're not moving very quickly. So if it requires an early example to encourage the others, find it and do it. I didn't do that at Gallagher. I kept somebody in place, and when I had the power to remove them during 6 months, the first 6 months, and ever after, they were a nuisance, undermining me politically with poor behaviours, but they had powerful protectors. So my inclination was to trust and to try and turn the situation round and believe the best in somebody, and I was really let down, and it ultimately made that whole experience much harder. I should have trusted my instincts and moved much harder and faster. So don't take too long, and find an early example about the standards that you expect from your HR team by removing somebody and hiring somebody better.
Neil, you're a legend. Thank you so much for, I think that's what I've loved most about our conversation since we first met, is just your willingness to share your experiences, and that willingness for your legacy to be how you help others thrive in HR leadership, really. So I love your stories. I could sit here and listen all day, but I'm glad we extended it, and hopefully the people that had to drop off can listen back on these last 10 minutes or so. And the people that have stayed on, thank you for staying on as well. Just to recap, we are going to send you the ebook across, and in there it's going to bring to life these 7 points that Neil's just touched on. We kind of jumped around a bit, but hopefully you got a sense of what the ebook contains in terms of writing those things down. And just remind me, Neil, those 3 questions that you asked, are they in the ebook?
They are not.
I wonder if we can include those, because I think that's really powerful questions for anyone on this call to use, like you have in those one-to-ones in those 2 meetings as well. So in our follow-up email, we'll include those 3 questions in there as well.
Okay, great. Well, look, good luck, everyone. It's a genuine offer. If I can help anybody on this call at any point with anything, I may not be immediately available, but just try and find me. You'll find me on LinkedIn. I'm really happy with the professional life I now have in an eclectic mixture of different things, but I'm always going to be passionate about HR and helping HR professionals do the great job that I know organizations need us to do. And we are such a powerful function of our best. Hear,
hear. So the 90-day yearbook will come. Join us in our Employee Experience Hub. Neil's in there too, so that's another way, a great way of staying connected. Neil often shares his thoughts on content, so another great way to stay connected. And if you're interested in finding out more about WorkBuzz, then just pop us an email through at hello@workbuzz.com. But thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you found it useful, and go enjoy the sunshine. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.